Emeritus Professor and Senior Fulbright Scholar who has a number of significant publications to his credit. His publications are on wide-ranging themes. He has published on Rolf Ellison, Thomas Pynchon, Richard Wright, Joseph Heller, Subhash Chandra Bose, Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, W.H. Auden, and whatnot. For the past 20 years, he has been the motive force through his editorship behind the journal Remarkings, a biannual journal that provides for a healthy debate and a stimulating perspective on diverse literatures and on socio-cultural issues that have a bearing on literature and that have a contemporary import. Professor Jasbir Jain, a well-known scholar, has said that Professor Nibir Ghosh has created a multi-logue between literary themes and socio-cultural or philosophico-aesthetic systems through this journal. What amazes me when I take up an issue of Remarkings is its consistency in terms of quality, including the quality of its print and its font size, which have remained uniform over the years. American Dilemma reminds me of An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, published in 1944 by the Swedish Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal. It's a comprehensive documentation and analysis of the basic dilemma of the idea of the American creed and the realities of racial segregation and discrimination in the United States of America during the period of the 40s. The touchstone of this classic is the discrepancy between the American creed of respect for the inalienable rights to freedom, justice, and opportunity for all, and the pervasive violation of the dignity of the blacks. This seminal book laid the foundation for the civil rights and social justice, and it spurred President Truman to set up the first ever presidential commission on race relations and on desegregating the federal workforce and the armed forces. In 1941, Henry Luce proclaimed the 20th century as the American century. He was certainly not wrong. It was the century in which the United States became a hegemonic power of the world system. The two realities, that of Luce and that of Myrdal, interwove in the second half of the 20th century. The geocultural constraints of being a hegemonic power, and specifically the need to project a world image as the standard bearer of a free world, was a major factor in inducing the United States government to make some important changes in the position of the blacks in American society. If President Truman's executive order in 1948 desegregated the armed forces, the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court declared segregation unconstitutional. These decisions were critical elements in the process that subsequently resulted in a breakdown of many social barriers for the blacks. Although since 1970, African American writers led by Toni Morrison have earned widespread critical acclaim, African American literature has really been recognized since its inception in the late 18th century. African Americans during the second half of the 18th century joined the war of words between England and the rebellious colonies. The earliest African American writers sought to demonstrate that all men are created equal, as the Declaration of Independence required that Black Americans be extended the same human rights as those claimed by the white Americans. Advancing the social justice argument through the Christian gospel of universal brotherhood of humanity, African-born Phyllis Wheatley dedicated her poems on various subjects, the first African American book, to proving that Negroes, black as Cain, were not inherently inferior to whites in the matter of the spirit, and thus could join the angelic train, as he called it, as spiritual equals to the whites. In 1789, Equiano published his two-volume autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Equiano. Equiano has pioneered the slave narrative, the first-hand literary testimony against slavery, which by the early 19th century earned for African American literature an increasing readership in Britain as well as in the United States, and gave the African Americans their voice, their words in the war of words. There is then the phenomenon known as the Harlem Renaissance. I am only making a brief reference to some of the things which represented the flowering in literature and art of the New Negro movement of the 20s, epitomized in the New Negro, an anthology edited by Alan Locke. Richard Wright's fiction, autobiography, and social commentary dominated African American literature from the late 1930s to the early 1950s. In 1940, Richard Wright's monumental novel, Native Son, appeared, winning thunderous critical acclaim. Charting the violent life and death of a Chicago ghetto youth, Native Son revived the protest tradition of the 19th century African American literature, while of course eschewing its moralizing and sentimentality. The most enduring African American novel of the 1950s, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, answered the call for a new kind of black hero, and his participation in post Depression, post World War II American reality. Uh, in 1953, Baldwin's first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, testified to the piercing examination of African American consciousness. It's a novel of unprecedented honesty in its revelation of generational and gender conflicts between its central characters, who constitute an African American family haunted by self hatred, guilt, and the psychological scars of racism. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye's implicit endorsement of the Black is Beautiful slogan of the 1970s made it topical, but its attention to the psychology of oppressing, a psychology of oppression affecting a poor small town black girl diverged from the pattern of the black arts movement because of feminist criticism. uh, because feminist criticism centralizes women, it's socio-linguistic in nature and describes women's writing. And this and the gendered reading would involve reading with the experience of our biological sex, reading with a gender identity, reading with a gender role, that is, with the consciousness of the social construction of femininity. These various trends, along with a number of intertextual features, have provided a vibrant voice to the African American community in order to enable them to assert themselves and participate in the processes of nation making of the United States. I look forward with great pleasure to Professor Nibir Ghosh, a long-standing friend, to come forward with his much looked forward to address on the dimensions of the various dimensions of the American dilemma. Thank you very much, and I now request Professor Nibir Ghosh to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Professor Vishweshwar Rao. It's indeed a great pleasure to be speaking where I have such a long-standing friend as the chair. Dr. Ponda Nageswar Rao, all participants to this international conference who are attending this session. I extend to you my warmest greetings from the city of the Taj. Professor Vishweshwar Rao has thrown in brief a lot of light for all the participants to take note of. I have titled my talk American Dilemma and the Power of Words. American Dilemma, as Professor Vishweshwar Rao just informed you, is a 1944 book which created a flutter in the United States, and he is the Nobel laureate in economics. But rather than refer to the contents of the book, I have removed the article and mentioned only American Dilemma. Friends, when I talk of dilemma, I would like to begin with two epigraphs which I have appended to the talk. The first is by Frantz Fanon from Black Skin, White Mask. In this book, he says, when people like me, they tell me it is in spite of my color. When they dislike me, they point out that it is not because of my color. Either way, I'm locked into the infernal cycle. You can get a nuance of the dilemma. The other epigraph which I've used is from Alice Walker, who says, no person is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow. Friends, when you talk of American Dilemma, you naturally feel that a nation founded on the ideals framed by the Declaration of Independence, where the founding fathers on 4th July 1776 affirmed the need to create an enduring foundation for an ideal democracy, wherein it is recorded, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Friends, I think the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, doesn't figure in any other constitutions of the world, which is something very interesting. Similarly, you have writers like Walt Whitman, who in his Inscriptions to Leaves of Grass says, oneself I sing, a simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. So you feel that when the ideals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is there, then this is where the idea of the blacks, the Negroes who were formerly known and currently known by African Americans, you feel that this is something discordant with the ideals framed in their basic documents. But when you look at the dilemma of American democracy, the issue of racial discrimination is situated both in the superstructure and base of American society. Color prejudice is a personal as well as a political reality. You have had several documents, the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, 1868, The 14th Amendment, 1868, guaranteeing the Negroes the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, 1870, providing for Negro suffrage irrespective of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which still remains very distant from the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But, friends, whenever you're working on the racial aspect of American society, I mean, there have been other violations when you think of the Native Americans, the Cherokee trial, and the Trail of Tears. You will know that there have been gross inconsistencies in the American, as according to their documents and what they have been practicing. It was Abraham Lincoln who said at Gettysburg, "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Now, what I wish the participants to keep in mind when they're working on this aspect of American society is when you think of the racial issues, even the latest being Floyd George and others, you must also understand that it is a very different kind of a very strange kind of a nation, you may say, because this is probably a singular example in the history of civilization that slavery was abolished, not with the initiative and leadership of the slaves, but in a civil war between two parts of a white, essentially white nation. The blacks were mainly the spectators or witness to the civil war. So if a nation can go against its own proponents because some ideals are not being followed is, I think, a very strange kind of a situation which we must understand, rather than looking at race and saying that this is something very abominable and it should be just absolutely left to go to its ruins. You see what happens when you think of the slavery part, when you think of the sufferings that the blacks have undergone for centuries in America, you realize the extent of the problem. And when you realize this extent of the problem, you feel that what ultimately should be the solution. So rather than going through a particular authors or a series of authors, I would be talking about the power of words, basically about the transformations that have been brought about by those who believed firmly and with conviction that the nation divided against itself cannot stand, which Lincoln had uttered. When I think of, and when you think that there's a strange nation, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, if you move towards the end, you find the narrator is looking at the wall map and laughing at Columbus, wondering what an India he had found. So when I begin with the question of power of words, I would essentially focus first on a book which is of seminal importance in understanding any dimension of American society and the American dilemma. The book I'm talking about is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass an American Slave, written by himself, published in 1845. You look at the title of the autobiography. At the end, he writes, written by himself. Why? Because no one tends to believe or tended to believe at that point of time that a Negro, how can a Negro read and write? So one of the points that I would be raising is whenever an establishment is supporting a kind of a situation where you are daggers drawn with the ideals, then you have the counter narratives. And there is a statement by Chinua Achebe that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will be in their hands. So now, when you look at a book like the narrative of Frederick Douglass, you feel that what kind of light does it throw on the American slave system? And when he looks at it, what he is trying to project is the fact that what he had undergone as a matter of his own experience. Today, during the lockdown, if you scan the statements and the posts on the social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, or anything for that matter, you will find there are innumerable posts every day telling you the importance of reading, telling you the importance of education, and they are tempting you in so many ways that you should understand how it is important to read books, how it is important to develop your awareness through your books. But friends, this narrative that I'm talking about, published in 1845, you feel that this is a situation where a 10-year-old black boy is tied to the chains of slavery. He has the urge to read. He has the urge to write. He is fond of words. He understands the power of words, but the law forbids that he should be writing or reading. There are instances from the narrative which I would be sharing with you, friends, including some of the parts of the text, to tell you that a slave boy who never had the chance of knowing what a school is, who never had the chance of having encouraging parents who would try to tell him the importance of reading, he is so desperate under the chains of slavery, and he is beginning, the light has dawned on him, and he has awakened to the fact that reading can make a difference to his life. When he was 10 years old, Frederick had developed an inclination towards reading and writing while working with a couple called white couple, Mr. Hugh and Mrs. Sophia Orr. And strangely enough, this lady, Sophia Orr, took a liking to this boy and encouraged him to learn letters, to pronounce words, to learn to write. But one day, when she is doing this, she is seen by her husband. And what does the husband Hugh say? That learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. If you want to keep up the institution of slavery, you should ensure that the slave must not know anything concerning education because he will be spoiled. And when he hears this 10-year-old boy, that learning would spoil the best nigger in the world, in that age of immaturity, he has begun to understand that there is an inherent connection between education and freedom. And what does he do? He secretly teaches himself to read, and one day he hears the name of a school reader called the Columbian orator from some white boys of his age on the street. He's frequently mixing up with white boys on the street. And he managed to collect 50 cents by shining shoes of white folk, and he bought the reader. Friends, when first time I read this narrative, my immediate interest in research went to finding out what this Columbian orator contained. And I was quite surprised that this boy, he was totally enamored by so many pieces which was present in the Columbian orator, that he began to find a kind of an awakening in his consciousness. And so what he does, to buy a book, when in today's world you are being offered incentives to buy a book, you will get a discount, you will get this prize, you will get that prize and all that. This boy shines shoes of the white people for almost a month, collects 50 cents and buys the book. And what does he say about the book? I'll share this quote with you. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. What I read was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. One book makes this difference. It makes you aware of the wretchedness of slavery and the powerful vindication of human rights. And he goes on, the more I read, I could regard my enslavers in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes, gone to Africa, and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. If you move a few pages ahead of this description, you will see that another kind of an influence on the consciousness of the Black inhabitant is the influence of music. Again, you can see the power of words in the music. He began to hear those slave songs, and he notes in his autobiography, every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. What is significant about the autobiography is a lyrical tale of grit and determination that ultimately released him from the chains of slavery on 3rd September 1838, 7 years before he wrote this book. And he not merely got his freedom, in the history of America. No other abolitionist enjoys the kind of eminence which Frederick Douglass enjoyed during those days. And he became free in 1838, published this book in 1845, and he came to occupy some of the most important positions that was offered by the President of America. And he says that whatever urge I had to learn to read and write, this carved the pathway of freedom from slavery for me. And he himself mentions, though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose at whatever cost of trouble, how to learn to read. And he came to know that it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. Again, a part of some kind of a nuance of American dilemma. And when he talks about the music, he thinks of the deep hatred of slavery he has in his heart, because those songs are songs of suffering, songs of exploitation, songs of the kind of the suffering that they're undergoing, and which created a kind of sympathy for his brother in bonds. I would like to share one quote from the book, where he's making a kind of a judgment. For a long time, if you look at, and here I would digress for a second and tell you that their efforts, the blacks' efforts to come to terms with this racial discrimination, it went through several phases of their approach to religion. First, they saw their kind of freedom from slavery in Christianity, but then they realized that the God was a white God. Then they went to the nation of Islam, and you know, if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you will know how they were disillusioned ultimately with the nation of Islam. They had one great hope in communism, because communism talks of equality. It doesn't believe in racial discrimination. But if you read what the black writers like Richard Wright have written about their own experience, and if there is time, probably I'll discuss this incident because it's quite an interesting kind of thing. But going back to where I digressed, the lyrical power of words, how a slave who is his own teacher, who has had no formal schooling, who relied on books like Columbian Orator, how he writes, the lyrical intensity, which probably you will find some of the best American writers you can compare him with. He talks about the professed Christians in America, and look at his observation. They are always ready to sacrifice, but seldom to show mercy. They are they who are represented as professing to love God whom they have not seen, while they hate their brother whom they have seen. And in this kind of a way, when he shows the nuances of, that is why I say, when you talk of American dilemma, over the years, over the centuries, you will see how subtle the modes of oppression are becoming. As I told you in one of those epigraphs, when the when the white man loves a black man, it is in spite of his color. And at the end of this narrative, what is the hope that he talks about? Again, a quote from that. Sincerely and earnestly hoping that this little book may do something toward throwing light on the American slave system and hastening the glad day of deliverance to the millions of my brethren in bonds, faithfully relying upon the power of truth, love, and justice. A slave is not relying on the power of hatred. He is relying on the power of truth, love, and justice for success in my humble efforts, and solemnly pledging myself anew to the sacred cause, I subscribe myself, Frederick Douglass, signed Massachusetts, April 28, 1845. So you see that mere love of books, if you are prevented from reading a book, he realizes, why are they preventing me? And that sentence comes back to him, that you will spoil the best nigger in the world if you teach him to read and write. So he says, that means if I can break the fetters of my slavery, it has to be through what they do not want me to touch upon, and that is reading and writing. When you look at the kind of the developments that have come after the Civil War and all those proclamations and all that, then here I would like to emphasize that it is not merely just reading a book. It is a matter of conviction. And conviction is about what you feel very passionately against injustice, against oppression. Because as I mentioned yesterday in one of the sessions, a line from a statement by Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., who said, our lives begin to lose meaning when we remain silent about things that matter. And one is, through writing, you break that silence. Now, one of the questions, must come to the mind of every researcher. I'm living in India. Barring the caste discrimination, which is as violent and which is as horrible as racialism in America, what I feel is, what kind of a transformation am I seeking? And why should I read about African Americans? I'll read about India and whatever is happening. It is just for the sake of pleasure. No. I feel like what I'm sharing with you is many decades of my involvement with African American literature. And as a young lecturer, when I joined the teaching profession, I was passing through the aisles of the college library, and I suddenly chanced upon a title. The title said Invisible Man. I had read The Invisible Man by Aldous Huxley, but I looked at the title, opened the book, and sometimes I think it is a real matter of luck what you chance upon. And my eyes went to the lines from the epilogue, where it is written, I'm a man of bones and fiber. I'm a man who can breathe and who's fully alive. but I'm invisible because they refuse to see me. So this kind of a conviction, of understanding in your consciousness, how important it is to know what you have to do in life. I'll give you the example of Langston Hughes. We have heard, and a lot of papers are there on Langston Hughes that you all must have read all these about it. There is a story about Langston Langston Hughes throwing all his books into the Mississippi. And when I tried to find out why did he throw all his books, I realized that he was trying to convey that the books will give you the consciousness, but what you have to do is right here in your mind, right here in your heart. And it is said that he was traveling by train, and in just 15-20 minutes of that travel, he had composed one of his loveliest poems, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, where he says, I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I've told you this narrative of preventing the oppressed race from reading. When you look at these words, which probably accelerated the Harlem Renaissance, and you see what he means by saying, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. You all, those who are dabbling in African American literature, have read about Richard Wright. Only recently, it has been discovered that he had written a book, The Man Who Lives Underground, which was not allowed to be published. The Random House refused to publish it because some reviewer at that point of time said that it will probably instigate violence. And during the course of all these discussions centering around the novel which now it is being published, and I think in about a week or fortnight, this book will be available for reading. During that kind of discussions, I came to find out that it was not only this book which was prevented from being published, it was even his books like Uncle Tom's Children, Native Son. The publisher had forced him to remove texts which they thought could incite, and Richard Wright had to remove them. And Richard Wright, one of his greatest contributions is that he realized, though later on we talked about Black is Beautiful and all that, he realized that the color of a Negro's skin makes him easily recognizable, makes him suspect, converts him into a defensive target. So the color of the skin, as Du Bois had said, the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the colored line. So when you read a novel like, when you read lines from Richard Wright, you see that he is trying to make you understand that how important it is to understand the politics of the color line. And yet, how do you fight against this kind of a racial discrimination, which is not only individual, but many claim that in racism in USA is institutional also. And Richard Wright in Black Boy, his autobiography says, whenever my environment had failed to support or nourish me, I had clutched at books. Reading was like a drug, a dope. The novels created moods in which I lived for days. What can words do? That is what I began with. And he writes at the end of his autobiography, I would hurl words into this darkness and wait for an echo. And if an echo sounded, no matter how faintly, I would send other words to tell, to march, to fight, to create a sense of the hunger for life that gnaws in us all. So he's not asking people to march. He says that I'm sending other words, to the echo that I've heard. He asked the words to march, to fight, to create a sense of the hunger for life that gnaws in us all. And then comes Ralph Ellison. The hero of Ellison's Invisible Man is the unnamed black narrator. Even Baldwin later has written a collection of essays which is titled, Nobody Knows My Name. And in the epilogue to the Invisible Man, Ellison writes, look at the kind of an understanding he's trying to share. Everywhere I have turned, somebody has wanted to sacrifice me for my good. Only they were the ones who benefited. I had thought they accepted me because they felt that color made no difference, because they didn't see either color or man. For all they were concerned, we were so many names scribbled on fake ballots to be used at their convenience, and when not needed, to be filed away. And it is not without a great deal of irony, that the narrator in Invisible Man, he shows that the torch of the Statue of Liberty is lost in the fog, implying thereby that the American idol of liberty is still a myth. Friends, when you look at the idea of double consciousness, you find that the women writers have not been lagging behind. Toni Morrison makes a statement. In this country, American means white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. Hyphenate, you're Asian American, African American, Mexican American, but you cannot be American. And if you look at the scene created by Trump to regain his presidency by hook or by crook, you will see that America arrived at a stage where the biggest custodian of the fundamental rights makes it clear with might and right that whatever is white is right. If white is might, then might is right. And the point which I would also expect lead the participants to reflect on is that how do we carry forward the efforts made by these writers, not only in America, but in other places too. And here is a statement by James Baldwin, who says, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated." A very important statement. So what happens? Education makes you conscious. And once you become conscious, you begin to examine the society. You begin to examine the issues. You begin to examine the problems that have cast you into the dungeons of slavery. And similarly, Toni Morrison endorses this kind of a conviction by stating, and this probably for we teachers is very significant a statement, the function of freedom is to free someone else. I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you're being so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. Friends, again, a part of the American dilemma. When I was in the US for my senior Fulbright, I interviewed almost a dozen African American writers. And apart from the writers, I talked to many academics and statesmen and intellectuals, and I asked them, is there any possibility that a woman or a Black can occupy the White House? At that point of time, they said, well, we cannot rule that out because, the American dream promises everything. But we cannot be sure, but the chances are pretty slim. So when Barack Obama became the president in 2008 for the first time, it was a realization of Martin Luther King's address called "I Have a Dream." And in that, he imagined a time when the sons of the slaves and the sons of the slave owners will sit at the common table of brotherhood, and a man will be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. And you see, in the form of when Obama became the president, it was a realization, probably partly of King's "I Have a Dream" speech and Hugh's dream deferred. But, we have been talking about education. We have been talking about the power of words. We have been talking about transformation that can come only through education, which will first make you conscious and then make you examine. And today, in America, the official statistics say that there are more Black children in jails than they are in schools. When you look at this kind of a dichotomy, when you look at this kind of a dilemma, and yet you have to ensure that things move on, and things have happened. After the Black Power movement, you have heard about the Black Lives Matter movement, which originated in 2013. And gradually, what is very significant about the Black Lives Matter movement is there were a large number of whites participating in the demonstrations against injustice that was being contested in the soil of America. So rather than end on a note of despair, I would like to bring this part of the session to a conclusion by sharing with what many of you may have heard yourself. The poem recited by Amanda Gordon at the inauguration of President Joe Biden on 20th January 21. What a beautiful way to look at a problem. And the title of the poem, she titled it, The Hill We Climb, which she recited, as you may have seen, with load of zeal and passion. The lines from a poem: we have braved the belly of the beast. We have learned that quiet isn't always peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet, the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we have weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president only to find herself reciting for one. She says, instead of becoming president, I'm just making a poem, I'm reciting a poem for a president. But the kind of hope is there. So basically what happens, another part of American dilemma is, no matter how miserable your life is in America, you would not be ready to leave America on your own. And today, the first choice of everyone who wants to go leave his country still remains the United States. It's not only India I'm talking about. I'm talking about the advanced European countries too. And she ends the poem by saying, we will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. And the last 4 lines are very heart-touching. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. There is always light. If only we are brave enough to see it. If only we are brave enough to be it. And with these words, I wish all the participants who are making such lovely presentations would be brave enough to see the light and would be brave enough to be the light. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh, for a very illustrative, scholarly lecture on wherein you have posited the American dream against the American dilemma. You have charted your way through racism as an institutional feature in American culture. You have very rightly pointed out that the torch of the Statue of Liberty continues to be foggy. You have spoken about the double consciousness built into the system. You have referred to the dilemma in both the basic structure and the superstructure of American society and constitution. You have made an excellent presentation on how the guarantees ensured by the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, for example, speaking about the rights, and the 15th speaking about Negro suffrage, all these have been sidelined by the idea of separate but equal, which phenomenon seems to be the truth of life in American society. You have very rightly quoted Achibi, who speaks about this proverb: until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. African, this explains the African rebuttals of colonial narratives. And likewise, you have shown through examples of how the uh, black consciousness has been reflected in their writing, and how a double consciousness is witnessed in American society as a whole in response to racism and racial issues. Thank you very much. And